Good afternoon. My name is David Evans, and I'm sorry not to be there with you in person, but I am excited to share the results of a systematic review that Pam Jakiela and Amina Mendez Acosta and I have been working on the heterogeneous impacts of childcare interventions on children in low and middle income countries. So this is a relevant issue at this time. Center-based childcare programs, whether that's daycare, preschool, or kindergarten, are widespread and they're expanding in low and middle income countries. These programs tend to reach kids from birth up until about 5 or 6 years old. Now, there have been a few reviews recently that have shown consistently positive effects of providing center-based care on women's labor force participation in low and middle income country contexts. This is unsurprising, right? When there are opportunities to put children in daycare settings, then women have more opportunities to be at work and to carry out independent economic activity. Now, what about the impact of these programs on children? There is some evidence in high-income countries of adverse impacts on children of childcare. So one example are the Baker and others studies, some short-run and long-run studies in Quebec showing some adverse impacts of daycare on children's outcomes. Now, our question is, how does center-based care impact children's outcomes in low and middle income countries across studies? And how do those impacts vary by children's characteristics? Or in other words, what are the heterogeneous impacts? So the approach that we use for this is to say, well, there have been a number of studies on this so far. So let's take this evidence together and see what we learn. So we conducted a systematic review of impact evaluations of early child development interventions targeting children aged 0 to 5 in low and middle income country settings. So we wanted research and studies from a wide range of disciplines. So we searched 4 different databases: EconLit for the economics literature, PubMed for more of the medical literature, Web of Science to cast a wide net, and PsycInfo for the psychological studies. We looked at papers published from 2005 onwards to get a sense of the recent literature, including unpublished working papers and preprints. We focused on randomized trials and also quasi-experimental studies. So difference in differences designs, regression discontinuity, instrumental variable studies. And then we added any additional studies that either were cited by the papers that we turned up or that cite the papers that we turned up, to make sure that we didn't miss anything that didn't come up in those studies. So altogether, we identify 72 impact evaluations of center-based care interventions. Most of these are either in Latin America and the Caribbean or East Asia and the Pacific. We have about 20 studies from each of those 2 regions. And then we have fewer studies, but a significant number from Sub-Saharan Africa. And then a few studies from East and Central Asia, from South Asia, and then just 3 studies from the Middle East and North Africa. So a little bit more about what we're finding. So what we mostly do here is we summarize the direction of effects rather than performing a formal meta-analysis where you standardize all the effect sizes across all the different outcomes. So the main reason we avoid a meta-analysis is because we have a lot of very different outcome measures. And I'll share more about this in a moment, but they're very different and it can be kind of hard to compare them. And so what exactly 0.1 of a standard deviation means across these wide range of outcome measures can be tricky. Now, historically, in this kind of situation, people would often use something called vote counting, where you'd look at the distribution of positive significant, positive insignificant, negative insignificant, and negative significant effects. So in recent years, this has become less commonly used for a couple of reasons. One is that because it really puts a high emphasis on statistical significance, it can undervalue substantively large effects that are less precisely estimated, but they might have high policy relevance, right? And so we have a really big effect, but it falls just below, the cutoff for statistical significance, whether that's 95% or some other cutoff. And we might put less weight on that, even though, it's a substantively large effect, which might really matter. And that kind of vote counting puts a lot of value on highly significant effects that might come from smaller, more controlled studies that might have less policy relevance. So following some guidance from the Campbell collaboration, we really focus on the direction of effects. Uh, the other point is that the answer to our fundamental question about what is the impact of childcare on children's outcomes obviously likely depends on a number of factors like the institutional quality. So, is this a high quality daycare setting? Is this a low quality daycare setting? We do have good evidence that the quality of care does matter for children's outcomes. So children in higher quality daycare settings do experience better outcomes. And it also likely depends on the child's counterfactual. So children who are, who would otherwise, in the absence of this center-based care, be experiencing some, high quality care environment at home are likely to have a different impact of center-based care than children who have, a less rich care environment at home. Now, few of the studies that we look at include either exogenous variation in institutional quality or often details on either institutional quality or children's outside care option. So I'm just going to say upfront, we are limited in how much we can say on that. And so the way to think about this is given current, what we think, what current institutional quality is, what is the average impact that we're observing on children's care outcomes? So I just want to give you a sense of the wide range of child development outcomes that we find across these studies. And so, for example, we look at outcomes for access, so programs that try to increase access to care. And then most of our outcomes are in actual children's outcomes, right? Like learning outcomes. There's just a handful of studies that measure later life outcomes, physical development, and social emotional well-being. And altogether, we have a total of more than 400 outcomes. To give you a sense of the wide variation and what that looks like, you can see, for example, in learning outcomes, we have the ability to count, expressive vocabulary, receptive vocabulary, results of an English test score, a draw a house task, a memory task, and there are many, many others. We have a long list in the paper. These are measured with lots of different instruments, the early grade reading assessment, the early grade math assessment, the Adela, the Woodcock-Johnson, the Ages and Stages, or ASQ, intelligence quotient tests. There's a wide range. We have this also similarly for physical development, everything from fine motor and gross motor skills to anthropometrics, body mass index, measures of sickness or health. And likewise, we have a wide range of socio-emotional well-being measures. And so there are a lot of outcomes, and this is why we feel like comparing, trying to standardize and compare effect sizes may make interpretation a little bit difficult. So with that in place, let's see, what do these look like? So fundamentally, the main thing we find is that the vast majority of results across these studies show that childcare interventions tend to benefit children. Right. And so in 4 out of 5 outcomes that we find across these studies, we find that children overall are better off as a result of participating in these center-based care interventions. And that's largely true whether we're looking at children in the preschool or kindergarten age range, as you can see in the second bar, or if we look at younger children in daycare, which often is children, from the age of birth up until the age of 2 or so. We see, it's just about 80% for all of these, for both of these categories. And so this is, I think, a pretty striking result. Just the fact that we find overall that, the vast majority of impacts tend to be positive. And, because we're not focusing purely on statistically significant impacts, this is less likely to reflect, kind of people gaming to get a statistically significant result, for example, in a quasi-experimental study. We just find that on average, it seems like on net, the childcare in low and middle income countries tends to benefit children. Now, the results I just showed you were on the estimates. We find a similar pattern across regions. So in this table, what you can see also is we have, so in the first column, we have the positive estimates. And if you look across all regions there in the first row, you can see about 81%, so 4 out of 5. If you look, rather than estimates, if you look at the net positive studies, we find a pretty similar result. And so the reason we do that is that, some studies have lots and lots of estimates. Some studies just have a couple of estimates. And so if you look at across all the estimates in a study and say, okay, well, on average, are these estimates positive? You can see we find, on average across all the regions, the result at the study level is even higher. So impacts are even more likely to be positive. And while we see some variation across regions, obviously the sample sizes are smaller as we go from region to region. And so I don't want to lean too heavily on this. But what we do find is a vast majority of positive effects across every region, whether we're looking at the positive estimates or whether we're looking at the net positive studies. And so this is an effect that's relatively consistent around the world in our sample. So, if even if we did kind of a traditional vote counting where we did look at statistical significance, we see a majority of positive significant effects across many outcomes. And so if you look at the top left here, you can see across all outcomes that more than 50%, whether we're looking at the daycare, the preschool and kindergarten, or at both levels together, more than 50% of these are positive and significant. And if you look at the total number that are positive, that's where we get to our 80%. If you look at access outcomes, so trying to boost access, those are a little bit lower. And what that suggests, so it's a little bit harder to get kids into these care centers. But what that means, if we're looking at actual children's outcomes, the averages tend to be even higher. So if you look at the learning outcomes there on the bottom left, you can see that it's much closer to 60% across all levels that are where the effects are positive and statistically significant. And then if we say just positive in general, it's more than 80%. And so with physical health and socio-emotional well-being, which you see on the right, again, we see the vast majority of effects are positive, a slightly lower proportion are positive and statistically significant, but the vast majority are positive. And it's still, between 40 and 50% are even statistically significant in that context. Now, I promised at the beginning that we'd talk not only about overall this general finding that it seems that childcare tends to have positive effects on children's outcomes in low and middle income countries, but what about the details of these children? So the first, we don't find as much evidence of treatment heterogeneity by age. And I mentioned this earlier. There's often a narrative that, for example, childcare, center-based care might be have adverse impacts for younger children, having less access to parental or relatives caring for them. And we just don't find that evidence in terms of children's outcomes. What we do find is that interventions focused on expanding access are less likely to have positive impacts on younger relative to older children. So it's harder to get younger kids into center-based care. Parents are less likely to want to put their kids into center-based care scenarios. But conditional on that, we don't see adverse effects on children's outcomes. So the second outcome that we find in terms of heterogeneity is we see no evidence of consistently larger or smaller impacts for more economically disadvantaged children. Now, obviously, this varies across studies, but what we can say is that on average, childcare cannot be said to make existing socioeconomic gradients better or worse. As an example of the variation, playgroups in Indonesia were best for the poorest kids, while daycare in Chile, when Chile was a middle-income country, was best for the least poor kids. In some cases, there's no difference. A childcare intervention in Nicaragua where it had similar impacts for poorer kids and richer kids. So on average, childcare isn't necessarily widening or narrowing, and the specific impact really varies across the context. One result that we find that is interesting is that impacts tend to be larger for girls than for boys. And so nearly 2/3 of our studies find larger impacts for girls than for boys. We see this in a preschool intervention in Algeria, a daycare intervention in Brazil that I was a part of evaluating together with Horacio Atanasio and others, a daycare intervention in Colombia. We do see this effect that there are more likely to be positive effects for girls, and then the size of the effects often tend to be larger for girls. And so, this is it shows that these care interventions may actually be beneficial in closing gender gaps where those are a challenge. So the fundamental takeaway here: center-based care tends to benefit child development in low and middle income countries, and common assumptions about differentially beneficial care for more disadvantaged or for older children don't seem to be borne out in our systematic sample, although we do observe these stronger, more consistent effects for girls. The last thing I'll mention is that most of this evidence stems from public center-based care. There's a lot left to learn, including about private centers at varying levels of formality, which likely represent a large proportion of childcare, right? So lots of people put their kids in care in maybe a center that is privately owned, that's more local to them. And we just have a lot left to learn about the impact of that kind of care on children's outcomes. But on average, this evidence is encouraging in that we see not only positive impacts of childcare on women's labor force participation outcomes, but we also see positive impacts in most cases for children. Thank you very much.